Sometimes a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to fight for. When you've got nothing left but your dignity and a faithful dog by your side, that's when you discover who you really are. Bucklin Hayes knew this, feeling all too well when he limped back into Widow's Hollow with his hound Rufus and a deed to his uncle's falling-down cabin. The townsfolk laughed at the sight of him, trying to fix up that old wreck. The roof was caving in. Weeds had taken over, and most folks figured he'd give up within a week. But Bucklin kept working day after day, fixing what he could. Then one morning, while pulling up some loose boards, he found something hidden underneath. What Bucklin discovered would make those same laughing neighbors come knocking at his door, with their hats in their hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like memories of better days as Bucklin Hayes stepped off the weathered wagon that had carried him the last 30 miles to Widow's Hollow. His right leg bore the stiffness of an old injury, a souvenir from his younger days, when pride and whiskey had gotten him into more scrapes than sense could get him out of. Beside him, Rufus shook the dust from his grizzled coat, the old blue-tick hound's eyes still sharp despite the grey around his muzzle. The town hadn't changed much in the 15 years since Bucklin had last seen it. Main Street still stretched between the same weathered storefronts, though some bore different names now. Henderson's general store had become Murphy's, and the old saloon where he'd spent too many evenings had a fresh coat of paint and a sign reading "The Pioneer Inn." Progress, folks called it, though Bucklin reckoned it was more like putting new wallpaper over old cracks. He pulled the deed from his coat pocket for the third time that morning, the paper soft with age and handling. His uncle Jeremiah's spidery handwriting declared him the rightful owner of 40 acres and whatever structures remained on Prospect Ridge. The lawyer back in Denver had been honest enough. Wasn't much left up there worth claiming, but it was legal and proper, signed and witnessed. "Come on, Rufus," Bucklin murmured, shouldering his worn canvas pack. "Let's go see what Uncle Jerry left us." The walk through town drew stares and whispers. Bucklin recognized some faces, though they wore more lines now, and their children had grown into adults he didn't know. Mrs. Caldwell swept her porch with unnecessary vigor, her eyes following his progress. Young Billy Hendricks, now sporting a deputy's badge and a considerable paunch, nodded with the kind of politeness reserved for folks you couldn't quite place. At Murphy's general store, Bucklin stopped to gather supplies. The proprietor, a thin man with nervous hands, looked him up and down like he was measuring him for a coffin. "You'd be Jeremiah Hayes's nephew," Murphy said, not quite making it a question. "That I am, Bucklin Hayes." He extended a weathered hand that Murphy shook briefly. "Heard you inherited the old place up on Prospect Ridge. Been empty since, must be 20 years now. Your uncle was quite the character." That he was. Bucklin selected salt pork, beans, coffee, and flour, simple provisions for simple needs. Place still standing. Murphy's laugh held little humor. "Well, parts of it are. Roof's got more holes than a colander, and I hear tell the foundation's starting to give way on the north side. Most folks figured whoever inherited it would just sell the land to old Morrison for grazing. Most folks figured wrong." The storekeeper's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "You mean to live up there? That place ain't fit for man nor beast. No offense to your uncle's memory, but he let it go to ruin in his final years." Bucklin paid for his goods without comment, but Rufus growled low in his throat, sensing his master's mood. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Nothing obvious, just folks who happened to be passing by or suddenly remembered urgent business that required them to linger on the boardwalk. "That's him," he heard someone whisper. "Jeremiah's nephew from back east. Heard he's fixing to live in that old wreck. Won't last a month up there. Come winter, he'll be begging for a warm bed in town." Bucklin pretended not to hear, but the words settled in his chest like cold stones. He'd heard similar talk before, in other towns, other times when circumstances had left him with little and folks with less charity. Pride was a luxury he'd learned to do without, but dignity, that was something a man held on to no matter what. The path to Prospect Ridge began behind the old church, winding upward through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen. Once it had been wide enough for a wagon, but years of neglect had let the forest reclaim much of it. Fallen logs blocked the way in places, and washouts from spring runoff had carved deep gullies that made footing treacherous. Bucklin took his time, favoring his bad leg and letting Rufus range ahead to scout. The dog knew these mountains in the way that all good hounds did, with his nose and instincts that went deeper than human understanding. They'd been partners for 8 years. Now, since Bucklin had found him half-starved and fighting off coyotes in a Colorado canyon. Trust was something they'd built together, mile by mile and season by season. The cabin appeared suddenly, as mountain dwellings often did, tucked into a natural clearing where Uncle Jeremiah had cut back the trees decades ago. Bucklin stopped and stared, his heart sinking like a stone in deep water. Murphy's description had been generous. The structure leaned to the left as if weary of standing upright. What remained of the roof sagged under the weight of fallen branches and decades of snow. The front porch had partially collapsed, leaving the door hanging at an odd angle. Windows that had once looked out over the valley were now gaping wounds, covered with boards that had warped and split, but it was still there, still standing after a fashion. Bucklin set down his pack and walked slowly around the cabin, Rufus at his heels. The foundation was field stone, laid by men who knew their trade, and most of it remained solid. The walls were good pine logs, chinked with mud and moss that would need replacing but showed no signs of rot. The problems were all things a man, with time and determination, could fix. He thought of his Uncle Jeremiah, who had built this place with his own hands after the war. Jeremiah Hayes had been a man of few words but strong convictions, someone who believed that a person's worth came from what they built, not what they inherited. He'd worked a small claim down in the valley, pulling enough gold from the creek to live simply and ask nothing from anyone. The inside of the cabin was a testament to years of loneliness and neglect. A cast-iron stove sat cold and rust-spotted. In one corner, a simple table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the single room, both pieces solid despite their coating of dust and debris. A ladder led to a loft that served as a bedroom, though the ceiling there showed multiple holes where weather had found its way in. But it was shelter, and it was his. That first night, Bucklin cleared a space on the floor and unrolled his bedding. Beside the cold stove, Rufus settled next to him, the dog's warmth a comfort against the mountain chill. Through the broken windows, he could hear the sounds of the forest settling into darkness, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine needles. He thought about the faces in town, the whispered comments and sideways looks. Some things never changed, no matter how far a man traveled or how many years passed. There would always be those who measured others by their possessions, who confused having little with being little. But up here, with only Rufus for company and the mountains for witnesses, Bucklin felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the peace of resignation, but the peace of possibility. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of making this place livable again. He would prove that a man's worth wasn't measured in gold or land or the opinion of neighbors, but in his willingness to build something lasting with his own 2 hands. The deed, crinkled in his pocket as he shifted position, a reminder of the gift his uncle had left him. Not just land and timber, but opportunity. The chance to start over, to build something meaningful in the time he had left. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from higher peaks. Winter would come early this year. Bucklin could feel it in his bones, but by then he intended to have a warm, dry place to weather it, no matter what the folks down in Widow's Hollow thought about his chances. 3 weeks into October, the morning air carried the sharp bite of coming winter when Bucklin discovered he wasn't alone on Prospect Ridge. He'd been working since dawn, prying loose boards from the cabin's front porch, when Rufus suddenly went rigid beside him. The hound's ears perked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Not the warning he gave for wildlife, but the sound reserved for human visitors. Through the trees came the creak of leather and the steady clip of horse hooves on stone. Bucklin straightened, hammer still in hand, and watched as 3 riders emerged from the pine shadows. He recognized the lead man immediately. Samuel Morrison, the largest landowner in the valley, whose cattle grazed on thousands of acres, stretching from Widow's Hollow to the territorial border. Morrison sat his horse like a man accustomed to looking down on others, his silver moustache perfectly groomed despite the early hour. Flanking him were his foreman Jake Coulter, a hard-eyed man with rope scars on his hands, and his son Daniel, barely 20, but already carrying himself with the arrogance that came from inherited wealth. "Morning, Hayes," Morrison called out, though his tone suggested it was anything but good. "Thought we'd ride up and see how you're settling in." Bucklin set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his pants. Rufus moved closer to his side, still growling softly. "Mr. Morrison, Daniel, Coulter," he nodded to each in turn. "Settling in just fine, thank you." Morrison's gaze swept over the partially collapsed porch, the sagging roof, and the debris scattered around the clearing. "Looks like you've got quite a project ahead of you. This place has been falling down for the better part of 20 years. "Buildings fall down when nobody tends them," Bucklin replied evenly. "Good thing I'm here to tend it now." Daniel Morrison snorted. "Tend it? Pop, look at this place. It'd take a miracle and a fortune to make this wreck livable again." "Daniel's got a point," Morrison said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man making a generous offer. "I've been keeping an eye on this property ever since your uncle passed. Was hoping whoever inherited it might see reason." "What kind of reason would that be?" Morrison reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "I'm prepared to offer you $800 for the land, cash money paid today. You could be back in Denver by week's end, with enough to start fresh somewhere the winters aren't so harsh." Bucklin accepted the paper and glanced at the figures written in careful script. $800 was more money than he'd seen in one place for years, enough to buy a small house in town somewhere, maybe even start a modest business. But something in Morrison's eagerness made him fold the offer back up without signing. "Generous offer," he said, tucking the paper into his shirt pocket. "Mind if I think on it a day or two?" Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, though I should mention that offer won't stand indefinitely. Winter's coming fast, and you'll find this mountain a hard place to survive once the snows start. I've survived hard places before. Have you?" Coulter spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the rough edge of a man who'd spent years breaking horses and harder things. "Survived them with a game leg and a graying beard? This ain't some line shack with other folks nearby. Up here, if something goes wrong, you're on your own." Bucklin felt heat rise in his chest, but kept his voice level. "I appreciate the concern. Truly, but I've been on my own more often than not, and I've managed to keep breathing so far." Daniel leaned forward in his saddle. "Look, old man, we're trying to do you a favor here. That cabin's going to collapse before Christmas. And when it does, you'll be sleeping in the snow. If you make it that long—" "Daniel," Morrison's voice carried a sharp warning, but his son was already wound up. "What? It's true. Everybody in town's talking about it. They're laying bets on whether he'll last till Halloween or give up and crawl back down the mountain before then." The words hit Bucklin like a physical blow, not because they surprised him, but because they confirmed what he'd suspected. He'd felt the stares in town, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when he walked past. The betting pools just made it official. He was entertainment to them, a curiosity to be wagered on, like a cockfight or a horse race. Rufus sensed his master's distress and moved closer, pressing against Bucklin's leg. The simple gesture of loyalty steadied him, reminded him that not all judgment came from small minds and smaller hearts. "Well then," Bucklin said quietly, "I reckon I'll have to disappoint some folks." Morrison studied him for a long moment. perhaps, recognizing something in Bucklin's tone that his son had missed. "Hayes, I'm going to speak plainly. This land borders my grazing territory. I've got plans for expansion, and this 40 acres sits right in the middle of what I need. Now, I'm willing to pay fair money for it, but if you're set on being stubborn—" "What?" Bucklin interrupted. "You'll make things difficult for me? Run me off my own land?" "I didn't say that. Didn't need to. I've heard that tone before, from other men in other places who figured they knew what was best for everyone." Bucklin picked up his hammer again, hefting its familiar weight. "But this is my land now, legal and proper. Got the deed to prove it." Coulter's hand drifted toward the pistol on his hip, a casual movement that might have been accidental to someone who hadn't learned to read such signs. But Bucklin had spent years in places where men settled disagreements with more than words, and he recognized the gesture for what it was. "Easy, Jake," Morrison said, though his eyes never left Bucklin's face. "No need for anyone to get excited. Hayes here is just exercising his property rights. Nothing wrong with that." "Course not," Bucklin agreed. "Just like there's nothing wrong with me working my land and living on it as I see fit." Morrison gathered, his reins signaling the end of the conversation. "Think about my offer, Hayes. $800 is good money, and like Jake said, this mountain can be unforgiving to those who aren't prepared for its challenges." They rode away without another word, but Bucklin could feel the weight of their attention even after the sound of hooves faded into the forest. He stood motionless in the clearing, hammer in hand, while something cold and hard settled in his stomach. The visit had changed everything, though he couldn't quite say how. What had seemed like simple skepticism from the townspeople now felt more deliberate, more coordinated. Morrison's offer, generous as it appeared, carried undertones that went beyond simple business. And the betting pools. They suggested a community that had already decided his fate, that was waiting not to see if he would fail, but when. That afternoon, Bucklin worked with unusual intensity, as if the physical labor could drive away the doubts that Morrison's visit had planted. He cleared more debris from the cabin's interior, patched 3 holes in the roof, and reinforced a section of the foundation that had been slowly settling. Rufus helped by carrying smaller pieces of wood in his mouth, the dog seeming to sense that today's work carried unusual urgency. As evening approached, Bucklin climbed onto what remained of the cabin's roof to secure a tarp over the largest hole. From that vantage point, he could see down into the valley, where Morrison's cattle dotted the grassland like scattered stones. The man owned more land than most small towns, controlled more wealth than Bucklin had ever imagined possessing. What was 40 acres to someone like that? A minor addition to an empire, barely worth noticing, but worth $800 in cash money, paid immediately, worth a personal visit and veiled threats, worth betting pools and coordinated pressure from an entire community. That night, as he sat by the repaired stove, with Rufus curled at his feet, Bucklin pulled Morrison's offer from his pocket and read it again by lamplight. The money would solve his immediate problems, give him enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere people didn't know his story or measure his worth by the state of his roof. But it would also mean surrender. It would mean admitting that the whispers were right, that some challenges were too big for worn-out men with game legs and aging dogs. It would mean Uncle Jeremiah's legacy, this small piece of mountain independence, would become just another parcel in Morrison's expanding holdings. Bucklin folded the paper and set it aside. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards. He hadn't yet replaced, and whistling through gaps in the chinked walls. Winter was coming, just as Morrison had warned. The cabin needed work, more work than one man could easily manage before the snows arrived. But surrender wasn't work. Surrender was giving up. And Bucklin Hayes had never been much good at that. He reached over to scratch Rufus behind the ears. "What do you think, old boy? Ready to show these folks what stubborn looks like?" Rufus opened one eye and thumped his tail against the floor. Not exactly enthusiastic, but steady and reliable, like everything else about the old hound. It would have to be enough. The week following Morrison's visit brought the first real snow of the season, not the heavy, blanketing kind that would come later, but a thin dusting that made everything slippery and reminded a man that time was running short. Bucklin woke to find frost covering the inside of his windows and his breath visible in the cabin's chill air. He'd managed to get the stove working properly, but heating the entire cabin would require more than the few cords of split wood he'd managed to gather. Every morning meant starting over, building a fire, melting ice for washing, coaxing warmth back into fingers stiff with cold. Simple tasks that would have taken minutes in a properly maintained home now consumed the better part of an hour. Rufus seemed to handle the conditions better than his master, the old hound's thick coat providing insulation that Bucklin's worn clothing couldn't match. But even the dog moved more carefully on the icy ground, picking his way across the clearing with the deliberate gait of an animal that understood the consequences of a careless step. On Thursday morning, Bucklin made his first trip back to town since Morrison's visit. His supplies were running low, and he needed materials for the cabin repairs: nails, tar paper, lamp oil, and a dozen other necessities that couldn't be improvised from forest resources. The walk down the mountain took longer than usual, his bad leg protesting against the uneven footing and cold that seemed to settle into his bones. Widow's Hollow looked different somehow, though he couldn't immediately identify what had changed. The same buildings lined Main Street, the same faces moved about their daily business, but something in the atmosphere felt charged, expectant. Conversations stopped when he passed, then resumed in whispers once he'd moved on. At Murphy's General Store, the proprietor's greeting held a note of surprise, as if he hadn't expected to see Bucklin again. "Still up on the mountain, I see. How are you managing with this cold snap?" "Managing fine," Bucklin replied, though the words felt hollow even to him. He began gathering supplies, checking items off a mental list he'd prepared during the long walk down. "Heard you had visitors last week," Murphy continued, his tone carefully neutral. "Samuel Morrison and his boys." Bucklin paused in his examination of a coil of rope. "News travels fast in a small town." "It does indeed, especially when it involves the Morrison family. Sam's been expanding his holdings for years now, bought up most of the smaller spreads in the valley. Folks figured your uncle's place would be next." "Folks figured wrong." Murphy nodded, but his expression suggested he thought Bucklin was making a mistake. "Sam's not a man who gives up easy. Once he sets his mind on something, he tends to get it one way or another." The warning was clear enough, though delivered with the kind of plausible deniability that let Murphy claim he was just making conversation. Bucklin paid for his purchases without responding, but the storekeeper's words echoed in his mind as he loaded everything into the canvas pack he'd brought for the purpose. Outside the store, he encountered the first direct challenge since his return to town. 3 men stood near the hitching post, positioned in a way that wasn't quite blocking his path, but made it clear they wanted to talk. Bucklin recognized 2 of them, ranch hands who worked for Morrison, but the third was a stranger, a thin man with nervous eyes and the soft hands of someone unaccustomed to physical labor. "Hayes," the stranger said, stepping forward. "Name's William Garrett. I represent certain business interests in the territory." Bucklin adjusted the weight of his pack and studied the man, everything about Garrett, from his pressed suit to his carefully trimmed beard, spoke of money and influence, the kind that rarely showed up in mountain towns without good reason. What kind of business interests? Development, investment opportunities, the railroads coming through this region within the next 5 years, and forward-thinking men are positioning themselves to benefit from the changes that will bring. One of Morrison's men shifted impatiently, but Garrett raised a hand to quiet him. "Your property sits in what will become a prime location once the rail line is established. I'm authorized to offer significantly more than local market value. $1,200, cash on delivery of a clear deed. $1,200, $400 more than Morrison's offer. Enough money to buy a decent spread in easier country, maybe even a small business in a growing town. Bucklin felt the weight of temptation, heavier than the pack on his shoulders. "That's generous," he said carefully. "Mind if I ask who's behind such generosity?" Garrett's smile was practiced, professional. "Investment consortium. Men who understand that progress requires vision and that vision requires capital. They're prepared to pay premium prices for strategic properties. And if I'm not interested in selling?" The smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered behind Garrett's eyes. "Everyone has a price, Mr. Hayes. Some people just need time to discover what theirs is." The conversation ended there, but Bucklin felt the weight of their stares as he walked away. 3 offers now, Morrison's $800, an anonymous consortium's $1,200, and the unspoken suggestion that refusal might bring consequences he wouldn't enjoy. The walk back up the mountain seemed longer than usual. Each step a deliberate choice to continue rather than turn around and accept one of the offers. The money would solve his problems, give him options he didn't currently possess. But it would also mean abandoning the only place he'd felt at home since leaving the army, surrendering to pressure tactics that felt increasingly orchestrated. Back at the cabin, Bucklin unloaded his supplies and tried to focus on immediate tasks. The roof needed work before the next storm, and the gaps between the logs required fresh chinking to keep out the wind. But his hands moved mechanically while his mind wrestled with larger questions. That evening, as he worked by lamplight to repair a section of window frame, he found himself studying Uncle Jeremiah's personal effects more carefully than he had before. His uncle had been a methodical man, keeping careful records of his activities and expenses in a series of small journals. Most entries were mundane: weather observations, notes about his mining claim, lists of supplies purchased in town. But scattered throughout were references that suggested Jeremiah had faced his own pressures over the years. "Morrison made another offer today," read one entry from 3 years earlier. "Told him same as always, not interested." Another, from the following year. "Coulter came by asking questions about the north boundary. Told him to check with the surveyor if he had concerns. The pattern was clear enough." Morrison had been working to acquire Uncle Jeremiah's land for years, probably increasing pressure as the old man aged and became more isolated. Only Jeremiah's death had ended the campaign temporarily. Now it was starting again, with new players and higher stakes. The railroad connection explained the increased urgency. $1,200 made sense if the land would be worth several times that amount once the rails came through. But it also meant the pressure would only increase until he either sold or proved definitively that he couldn't be moved. Bucklin closed the journal and looked around the cabin's single room. The stove provided warmth. The repaired windows kept out most of the wind, and the roof no longer leaked except in 2 places he'd marked for tomorrow's work. It wasn't much, but it was becoming home in a way no place had been for him in years. Rufus raised his head from his spot near the stove, ears pricked as if he'd heard something outside. Bucklin listened, but caught only the usual night sounds: wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the settling of timber in the cold. But the dog remained alert, and after 8 years together, Bucklin had learned to trust Rufus's instincts. He banked the fire and checked that the door was properly barred before settling into his bedroll. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more pressure, probably another visit from someone wanting to make his decisions for him. But tonight, at least, he was warm and dry in a place that belonged to him, with a dog who asked nothing more than food and companionship. It was a start. The harassment began small, the way such things always did, subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability while clear enough to send a message. It started with his water supply. Bucklin had been drawing water from a spring about 50 yards behind the cabin, a reliable source that Uncle Jeremiah had diverted through a simple wooden flume system. The water was clean and cold, flowing steadily even as temperatures dropped and other sources began to freeze. But on the third morning, after his encounter with Garrett, Bucklin found the flume broken, its wooden channels scattered across the ground as if a heavy animal had trampled through them. Rufus sniffed at the debris, whining softly. The dog's nose found boot prints in the soft earth around the spring, human tracks, not the hoof prints that would have marked the passage of deer or elk. Someone had deliberately destroyed the water system, though they'd been careful to make it look like an accident. Rebuilding the flume took most of the day, work that pushed back other urgent repairs as winter settled deeper into the mountains. Bucklin carved new channels from fallen pine logs, fitted them together with the careful precision his uncle had taught him years ago, and tested each joint to ensure the water would flow cleanly. By evening, the system worked again, but the message had been delivered. 2 days later, it was his woodpile. Bucklin had spent weeks gathering and splitting deadfall, building a supply that would see him through the worst of winter. He'd stacked it carefully beside the cabin, covering it with canvas to keep the wood dry and ready for burning. But he woke one morning to find the pile scattered, logs thrown in all directions, as if a whirlwind had struck. Again, Rufus found human scent among the scattered wood. Again, the destruction was thorough enough to require hours of work to undo, but subtle enough that an outsider might attribute it to winter storms or wildlife. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone wanted him to understand that his isolation made him vulnerable, that the mountain could be a dangerous place for those without friends. Bucklin restacked the wood without complaint, but this time he took precautions. He strung thin wire between trees around the cabin's perimeter, positioning it at ankle height, where it would catch anyone moving carelessly in the dark. He also began keeping his rifle closer at hand, cleaning and loading it each evening before settling in for sleep. The third incident was more direct. Bucklin was working on the cabin's north wall, replacing rotted chinking between the logs, when a rifle shot cracked across the clearing. The bullet struck a pine tree 20 feet to his right, sending bark flying and causing Rufus to yelp in alarm. Bucklin dropped flat behind a pile of firewood, his own rifle already in his hands. He waited, listening for movement in the forest, but heard only the echo of the shot rolling across the mountains. After 10 minutes of silence, he carefully raised his head. "That was a warning shot," he called out to the trees. "Next time might not be." No answer came from the forest, but the message was clear enough. Someone wanted him afraid, wanted him looking over his shoulder and questioning his decision to stay. The shot had been placed deliberately, close enough to frighten, but far enough away to avoid actual harm. Professional intimidation, the kind used by men who understood the difference between persuasion and murder. That evening, Bucklin sat by his stove with Uncle Jeremiah's journals spread before him, searching for clues about what his uncle might have faced during his final years. The entries became more sparse as Jeremiah aged, but a pattern emerged that chilled Bucklin more than the mountain air. "Someone's been in the cabin while I was down at the creek," read one entry from 2 years ago. "Nothing taken, but things moved around. They want me to know they can get in whenever they choose." Another entry, dated 6 months later. "Found my trap line cut. Weeks' worth of pelts lost. Starting to think I should have taken Morrison's offer years ago." The final entries were the most disturbing. Jeremiah's handwriting became shaky, uncertain, as if written by a man whose confidence had been systematically eroded. "Can't prove anything, but I know they're watching. See lights in the forest some nights, moving where no lights should be. Maybe I'm getting too old for this mountain." The last entry was dated just 3 weeks before Jeremiah's death. "Decided to make arrangements. If something happens to me, want Bucklin to have the place. He's got the spine to stand up to bullies, something I've lost along the way." Bucklin closed the journal and stared into the stove's glowing coals. His uncle hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been slowly worn down by the same campaign of harassment that was now being directed at his nephew. The isolation, The mysterious incidents, the gradual erosion of safety and peace, had broken an old man's spirit as surely as physical violence might have broken his body. But Bucklin wasn't his uncle. He'd spent years in places where survival depended on vigilance and quick responses to threats. The army had taught him patience and planning, while subsequent wanderings had reinforced lessons about dealing with predators, both animal and human. The next morning brought fresh snow and a visitor. Bucklin was splitting kindling behind the cabin when he heard horse hooves on the trail. This time the rider was alone, Daniel Morrison, barely 20 but carrying himself with the cocky assurance of youth that had never faced real consequences. "Morning, Hayes," Daniel called out, staying mounted, as if to emphasize the height advantage. "Pa sent me to check on you, make sure you're managing all right up here." Bucklin continued splitting wood, each swing of the axe precise and controlled. "Kind of him to worry. Tell him I'm doing fine." "Are you? Heard you've been having some troubles lately. Accidents, you might say." The tone was casual, conversational, but Bucklin caught the underlying satisfaction in the young man's voice. Daniel knew about the harassment, might even have participated in it. The realization settled in Bucklin's stomach like a cold stone. "Accidents happen," Bucklin replied evenly. "Man learns to deal with them or he doesn't last long in country like this." Daniel's horse shifted impatiently, sensing something in the atmosphere. "Thing is, Hayes, accidents tend to multiply when a man's in the wrong place. Sometimes it's better to recognize that and move on before things get worse." Bucklin set down his axe and turned to face the young man directly. "Is that a threat?" "Son, just friendly advice. This mountain's claimed its share of folks over the years, men who thought they were tough enough to handle whatever came their way." Daniel's smile was cold, practiced. "Sometimes they were wrong, and sometimes," Bucklin said quietly, "men who think they can intimidate others discover they've picked the wrong target." Something in his tone must have penetrated Daniel's confidence, because the young man's smile faltered slightly. He gathered his reins, as if preparing to leave, then paused. "Pa's offer is still good, Hayes. $800, no questions asked, but offers like that don't last forever. Neither do men who make threats they can't back up." Daniel's face darkened, but he spurred his horse toward the trail without another word. Bucklin watched him go, then picked up his axe and returned to splitting kindling. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing with calculations and possibilities. The confrontation had clarified things, stripped away the pretense, and revealed the true nature of what he was facing. This wasn't about business or development, opportunities. It was about power and the willingness to use intimidation to get what you wanted. Morrison's consortium, whoever they really were, had decided that Bucklin Hayes was an obstacle to be removed, and they'd apparently succeeded in removing his uncle through patience and psychological pressure. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. Unlike Uncle Jeremiah, who'd lived alone for decades and had no experience with organized harassment, Bucklin had spent years dealing with men who thought force and fear were acceptable tools of persuasion. He knew how such campaigns worked, understood their strengths and weaknesses. Most importantly, he knew that bullies, no matter how well funded or organized, usually folded when their targets refused to be intimidated. That evening, Bucklin began, preparing for a different kind of winter than he'd originally planned. Instead of simply surviving until spring, he would need to actively defend his position against enemies who had resources, local support, and apparently few scruples about how they achieved their goals. It would be a test of more than just his determination to stay on the mountain. It would be a test of everything he'd learned about standing ground when retreat seemed like the sensible option. November brought the kind of storm that reminded men why the mountains commanded respect. Snow fell for 3 days straight, piling against the cabin walls and bending pine branches until they snapped under the weight. The wind howled through the trees with a voice that seemed almost human, and temperatures dropped so low that even the fire in Bucklin's stove barely kept the single room habitable. But the storm also brought unexpected allies. On the second day, As Bucklin struggled to keep a path clear to his woodpile, he heard voices through the blizzard. At first, he thought the wind was playing tricks on him, but Rufus barked sharply and ran toward the edge of the clearing. Through the swirling snow came two figures on horseback, moving slowly through drifts that reached their stirrups. The lead rider was a woman, though Bucklin couldn't make out much more than that through her heavy winter clothing. Behind her rode a man of perhaps 40, lean and weathered in the way of someone who spent his life outdoors. Both looked half-frozen, their horses picking their way carefully through the treacherous footing. "Hello, the cabin!" the woman called out. "We're caught in this storm and could use shelter for the night." Bucklin lowered the rifle he'd instinctively reached for and waved them toward the small, lean-to structure he'd built for his own horse. "Come ahead. Get those animals under cover before they freeze." It took 20 minutes to get both horses settled with what hay Bucklin could spare and blankets to keep them from the worst of the cold. The riders followed him into the cabin, stomping snow from their boots and pulling back their hoods. The woman was perhaps 50, with grey-streaked brown hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they swept the cabin's interior. Her companion was younger, with the sun-darkened skin and calloused hands of a working cowboy, but something in his manner suggested he was more than just hired help. "I'm Sarah Dalton," the woman said, extending a hand that gripped Bucklin's firmly. "This is my foreman, Tom Reeves. We run a small spread about 20 miles south of here. Bucklin Hayes. Welcome to what's left of my uncle's place." Sarah accepted the cup of coffee he offered and warmed her hands around it gratefully. "Jeremiah's nephew. I heard you'd inherited this place. Sorry for your loss. Jeremiah was a good neighbor, even if we didn't see him often." "You knew my uncle?" "Some. He helped us out a few times when we had cattle wandering up into the high country. Always fair in his dealings. Never asked for anything in return." She paused, studying Bucklin's face. "Heard you've been having some troubles lately." Tom spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested origins south of the territorial border. "Word gets around, especially when it involves the Morrison family. They've been expanding their holdings pretty aggressively the past few years." Bucklin refilled their coffee cups and settled into his own chair. Outside, the storm continued. Its assault on the cabin, but inside, the presence of other people made the small space feel warmer and more secure than it had in weeks. "What kind of expanding?" he asked. Sarah and Tom exchanged glances, the kind of look that passed between people who'd worked together long enough to communicate without words. "Started about 5 years ago," Sarah said carefully. "Small ranchers began selling out, usually after a run of bad luck. Cattle getting loose, water sources drying up, accidents happening to equipment and livestock. Nothing you could prove, but patterns that made folks nervous. Those who tried to hold out found life getting increasingly difficult," Tom added. "My previous employer was one of them. Stubborn old German who swore he'd never sell to Morrison. Then his barn burned down. His prize bull turned up dead, and his hands started quitting for better-paying jobs elsewhere." "Where elsewhere?" Morrison's spread. Seemed he was always hiring just when other folks were losing help. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "Point is, Hayes, you're not the first person to face this kind of pressure. And from what we hear, it's only going to get worse now that there's railroad money involved." "Railroad money?" "That consortium that made you the offer. They're backed by railroad interests, looking to secure right-of-way through the territory. Your land sits right where they want to run the main line through the mountains. Control that, and you control access to half the mining claims in the region." The information settled pieces of a puzzle Bucklin hadn't even realized he was trying to solve. Morrison's persistent offers, the mysterious consortium, the escalating harassment. It all made sense if his 40 acres represented a crucial bottleneck for a railroad line worth millions of dollars. "How do you know all this?" he asked. Tom smiled grimly. "Because Sarah's been fighting the same battle you are, just on a larger scale. Her ranch sits on what would be a perfect spot for a rail station. And she's been getting pressure to sell for over a year now. Different kind of pressure, mostly, Sarah clarified. Legal challenges to our land patents, disputes over water rights, attempts to have our cattle declared diseased. But the message is the same: sell or face consequences. Outside, the storm showed no signs of weakening, and Bucklin found himself glad for the company, despite the grim nature of their conversation. It had been weeks since he'd talked with anyone who wasn't trying to intimidate or manipulate him, and the simple normalcy of shared coffee and honest discussion felt like a luxury he'd forgotten he missed. "So, what's your plan?" he asked, assuming you have one. Sarah and Tom exchanged another look, this one carrying a weight of shared determination. "We fight," she said simply. "Not just for our own places, but for everyone who's been pushed around by Morrison and his backers. There are more of us than you might think. Small ranchers, miners, townspeople who've gotten tired of being told what's best for them by men who've never worked an honest day in their lives." "What kind of fighting are we talking about?" "Legal, mostly. Documentation, witnesses, making sure every dirty trick gets recorded and reported to the territorial authorities. Morrison's been careful to keep his hands clean, but patterns have a way of becoming evidence when you document them properly." Tom reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. "We've been keeping records for over a year now. Incidents, dates, witnesses, financial records, showing how Morrison benefits every time a neighbor faces troubles. It's starting to paint a picture that even bought judges would have trouble ignoring." Bucklin studied the portfolio without opening it. The idea of organized resistance appealed to him in ways that simple endurance did not. Fighting alone was one thing, but fighting as part of a larger effort to stand up to systematic bullying, that felt like something worth doing. "What would you need from me?" "Documentation of everything that's happened to you since you arrived. Names, dates, details about the offers you've received and the harassment you've faced. Your uncle's journals would be especially valuable. They show this has been going on for years." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "But I want you to understand what you'd be getting into, Hayes. This isn't just about your 40 acres anymore. If we're right about the railroad connection, there are powerful people with serious money at stake. They've shown they're willing to use intimidation and sabotage. If that doesn't work, they might escalate to worse." The warning hung in the air between them, mixing with the sound of wind and the crackle of logs in the stove. Bucklin thought about Uncle Jeremiah's final journal entries, about the broken old man who'd given up fighting because the cost had become too high. Then he thought about Daniel Morrison's cocky threats and Garrett's cold smile. How many others are involved in this documentation effort? 6 families so far, plus a few townspeople who've been keeping quiet records of Morrison's business dealings. Not an army, but enough to make a case if we can get the right people to listen. Tom added, "The territorial governor's been making noise about corruption in land deals and railroad contracts. If we can present him with solid evidence of a pattern, he might be willing to act." Bucklin made his decision with the certainty that came from finally understanding the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just about his right to live on his uncle's land. It was about whether ordinary people could stand up to organized. "Wealth and intimidation. Count me in," he said, "but I want to understand something first. Why now? Why are you telling me this instead of letting me fight my own battles?" Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the cabin. "Because we've been watching how you handle yourself, Hayes. Most folks would have taken Morrison's first offer and been grateful for it. A few might have held out until the harassment started, but you're still here, still working on your cabin, still refusing to be intimidated. That tells us you're someone we can count on when things get difficult." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the cabin, something had changed. Bucklin was no longer facing his challenges alone, and the knowledge that others were fighting similar battles made his own resistance feel less like stubborn pride, and more like part of a larger stand for principle. It was a dangerous alliance to join. But then again, he'd been in danger since the day he decided to stay on Prospect Ridge. At least now he understood the stakes and had allies who shared his determination to see the fight through to its conclusion. The storm cleared on the third day, leaving the world transformed under a blanket of pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning sun. Sarah and Tom prepared to leave after helping Bucklin dig out his woodpile and check on his horse. But their departure felt different from other goodbyes he'd experienced on the mountain. For the first time since arriving at Widow's Hollow, he wasn't entirely alone. Before mounting her horse, Sarah handed him a small wrapped package. "Something to help with the documenting," she said. Tom's idea, actually. Inside the oilcloth wrapping, Bucklin found a bound notebook and 2 pencils, along with a carefully written list of details to record for each incident. Dates, times, weather conditions, witnesses, exact words spoken, physical evidence found, the kind of methodical approach that could turn scattered harassment into legal proof of conspiracy. "Been thinking about your situation," Tom said as he settled into his saddle. "Morrison's people have been careful to make everything look random, but they've got a weakness." "What's that?" "They're impatient. Railroads pushing for right-of-way. Agreements, and that means they need your land secured soon. Impatience makes people sloppy, and sloppy people make mistakes we can document." They rode away through snow that muffled their horses' hoofbeats, but Bucklin felt their presence lingering in the cabin like the scent of Sarah's coffee. That evening, he began the first entry in the documentation notebook, recording everything that had happened since his arrival in Widow's Hollow. The process of writing it down, organizing events chronologically and noting patterns, revealed details he'd missed while living through them. Morrison's first visit had come exactly 3 weeks after Bucklin's arrival. Not spontaneous neighborliness, but calculated timing that suggested someone had been watching and waiting. The harassment had escalated in precise stages: property damage, direct threats, and finally the shooting incident. Each escalation had been preceded by an offer to buy, as if someone was carefully calibrating pressure to match resistance. Most telling was the coordination. The mysterious consortium's offer had come immediately after Morrison's visit, suggesting communication between parties who were supposedly independent. And Daniel Morrison's cocky threats had carried the confidence of someone who knew his actions were protected by powerful allies. 3 days after Sarah and Tom's departure, the pattern continued exactly as Tom had predicted. Bucklin was working on the cabin's south wall, replacing logs that had rotted near the foundation, when he heard horses approaching. This time it was Jake Coulter alone, riding a different horse than usual and carrying a canvas bag across his saddle. "Morning, Hayes," Coulter called out, though his tone held no warmth. "Thought you might be interested in seeing something." He dismounted and opened the canvas bag, revealing the carcass of a small dog. Not quite a puppy, but young enough to evoke sympathy. The animal had been shot through the head, execution style, and its coat was matted with frozen blood. "Found this on Morrison land this morning," Coulter said, his voice carefully neutral. "Figured it might belong to you, since we don't keep dogs that size on the ranch." Bucklin examined the carcass without touching it. The dog was a mixed breed, brown, and white markings similar to Rufus but smaller and younger. Someone had selected it specifically for its resemblance to his companion, though whether they'd stolen a pet from town or acquired the animal specially for this purpose, he couldn't tell. "Not mine," he said evenly. "Rufus is right there." Coulter followed his gaze to where the old hound lay in a patch of sunshine beside the cabin, apparently napping, but with one eye cracked open to monitor the conversation. "Shame," Coulter said. "Hate to see animals suffer for their owners' poor decisions. Sometimes innocent creatures pay the price when folks choose to be stubborn about things that don't really matter." The threat was clear enough, but delivered with plausible deniability. If questioned later, Coulter could claim he'd simply been returning what he thought was Hayes's lost pet. The execution-style killing and carefully chosen victim were designed to send a message while providing no legal evidence of wrongdoing. Bucklin recorded every detail in his notebook that evening, including sketches of the dog's wounds and Coulter's exact words. The incident represented a new level of psychological warfare, one that targeted not just his property or safety, but his emotional attachments. Someone had studied him carefully enough to understand that threatening Rufus would be more effective than threatening the cabin. But they'd also made their first serious mistake. The dog's execution showed escalation, beyond petty harassment into deliberate cruelty, the kind that might motivate witnesses to come forward if properly documented. More importantly, the animal had to have come from somewhere, either stolen from a family in town or purchased from someone who would remember the transaction. That afternoon, Bucklin began his own investigation. He walked down to Widow's Hollow, with Rufus at his side, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but actually to ask careful questions about missing pets. At Murphy's store, he mentioned seeing a dead dog that looked like it might have belonged to someone in town. "Can't say I've heard about any missing dogs," Murphy replied, but his nervous manner suggested otherwise. Of course, animals get loose all the time, especially when folks don't take proper care of them. The comment felt like another veiled threat, but Bucklin pressed gently. This one looked young, maybe 6 months old, brown and white markings, medium size. Someone's probably missing it. Murphy's eyes darted toward the back of the store, where voices murmured in conversation too low to overhear. "Might ask over at the livery stable. Pete Williams sometimes knows about animals people are trying to find homes for." At the livery stable, Bucklin found a different kind of reception. Pete Williams was a grizzled man in his 60s who'd been shoeing horses and tending livestock since before the town had a proper name. He listened to Bucklin's description with growing concern. "That sounds like the pup that belonged to the widow Henderson," Williams said quietly. "Little thing went missing 3 days ago. She's been asking around, thinking maybe it wandered. Often got lost. Where does Mrs. Henderson live?" Williams pointed toward a small house at the edge of town, then lowered his voice further. "Might be careful how you approach this, Hayes. Word is that certain folks in town don't appreciate people asking too many questions about things that don't concern them." But Bucklin's conversation with Mrs. Henderson revealed details that transformed the incident from intimidation into evidence of criminal activity. The widow was a frail woman in her 70s who lived alone with only her dog for company. The animal had disappeared from her fenced yard in broad daylight, taken by someone who'd had to climb over a 4-foot fence to get access. "He was all I had left," she said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Never strayed from the yard, never bothered anyone. Can't understand who would take a harmless little thing like that." Bucklin didn't tell her what had happened to her pet, but he recorded every detail of their conversation in his notebook. The theft of an elderly widow's companion animal represented a level of cruelty that would outrage any decent jury, especially when connected to the larger pattern of harassment and intimidation. That evening, he composed a careful letter to Sarah Dalton, describing the incident and its implications. If the resistance movement needed evidence of Morrison's willingness to cross moral lines, the execution of Mrs. Henderson's dog provided it in ways that property damage and vague threats could not, but the incident also clarified the stakes of his decision to stay. These weren't honorable opponents engaged in legitimate business competition. They were people willing to torment elderly widows and execute innocent animals to achieve their goals. Fighting them wasn't just about property rights or personal pride anymore. It was about whether cruelty would be allowed to triumph over decency. Bucklin looked across the cabin at Rufus, who was gnawing contentedly on a soup bone. The old hound's presence had been a constant comfort during the lonely weeks on the mountain, and the thought of anything happening to him because of human greed and callousness filled Bucklin with a cold anger that surprised him with its intensity. He'd faced many challenges in his life, endured hardships that would have broken lesser men, but he'd never fought enemies who targeted innocent creatures to make their point. The realization that he was dealing with people capable of such casual cruelty changed something fundamental in his approach to the conflict. No longer was this simply a matter of standing his ground until spring. Now, it was about ensuring that Mrs. Henderson's dog hadn't died for nothing, that the people responsible faced consequences for their actions, and that future victims wouldn't have to endure similar treatment. The documentation notebook lay open on his table, pages filling, with evidence that could someday see justice done. But first, he had to survive long enough to present that evidence to people with the power to act on it. Outside, wind picked up through the pines, carrying the promise of more snow and the reminder that winter was far from over. But inside the cabin, Bucklin felt a grim determination settling into his bones like marrow. He'd found his cause worth fighting for, and it went far beyond his own stubborn refusal to be intimidated. Some battles, he reflected, chose the warriors rather than the other way around. This appeared to be one of them. December brought the kind of cold that made a man question whether staying alive was worth the effort it required. Ice formed on the inside of the cabin windows each night, and Bucklin's breath clouded even near the stove. But the harsh weather also brought an unexpected gift, solitude so complete that even Morrison's harassment campaign seemed to pause in deference to winter's sovereignty. It was during one of these brutally cold mornings, while splitting kindling behind the cabin, that Bucklin made the discovery that would change everything. He'd been working to free a section of frozen firewood when his axe struck something that rang like metal instead of splitting like wood. Curious, he cleared away snow and debris to reveal a corner of rusted iron protruding from the ground. What he'd found was an old strongbox, buried perhaps 2 feet deep and protected by a layer of flat stones that had been carefully arranged to shed water. The lock had long since rusted away, and the hinges protested with squeals of corroded metal as he pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected them from decades of moisture, were items that made Bucklin's hands tremble as he lifted them into the weak winter sunlight. Uncle Jeremiah's war records, discharge papers, commendations, and detailed service reports revealed a history that no one in Widow's Hollow had ever mentioned. Lieutenant Jeremiah Hayes, according to the faded documents, had served with distinction in the Union Army's Corps of Engineers, specializing in railroad construction and bridge building. He'd been present at the construction of crucial supply lines that had helped win the war, and his knowledge of railroad engineering had been considered valuable enough to earn him several commendations from senior commanders. But it was the second layer of documents that truly stunned Bucklin. Survey maps, hand-drawn with the precision of military engineering, showed not just Uncle Jeremiah's 40 acres, but the entire valley system surrounding Widow's Hollow. The maps included detailed notations about elevation, water sources, soil, stability, and optimal routes for railroad construction. According to Uncle Jeremiah's careful annotations, 3 possible routes existed for a railroad line through the mountains. The northern route required expensive tunneling through solid granite. The southern route would need massive trestle bridges across unstable canyon floors. But the central route, the one that passed directly through Prospect Ridge, offered the only practical path that avoided both tunneling and major bridge construction. More than that, Uncle Jeremiah had identified the exact location where any railroad following the central route would need to establish a crucial water stop and maintenance facility. The spot was marked with careful measurements and engineering calculations, and it sat squarely in the middle of the 40 acres that Bucklin had inherited. The final item in the strongbox was a leather journal filled with Uncle Jeremiah's private thoughts during his final months. Unlike the journals Bucklin had found in the cabin, this one revealed a man who understood exactly what forces were arrayed against him and why. "Morrison doesn't know what I know," read one entry from 6 months before Jeremiah's death. He thinks he's buying land for grazing, but the railroad scouts have been through here twice in the past year. They need this exact spot for their maintenance station, and they'll pay whatever it takes to get it. Another entry revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Garrett isn't representing any consortium. He's working directly for the Central Mountain Railroad Company. They've been buying up land all along their planned route, using local men like Morrison as fronts to keep prices down. If people knew the railroad was behind the purchases, land values would triple overnight. But it was the final entry that made Bucklin's blood run cold. They've made it clear that selling is my only option, but I've got something they don't know about. The engineering survey I did during the war proves their route won't work without this particular water source. They need my land, but they also need the knowledge I've accumulated about making their railroad function in mountain terrain. If they force me out, I'll make sure that knowledge goes with me. Uncle Jeremiah had been far more than the simple mountain hermit everyone believed him to be. He'd been a trained engineer who understood exactly why his land was valuable and had documented that value in ways that could be used against those trying to steal it from him. His death had likely come just as he was preparing to reveal the truth about the railroad conspiracy and demand fair compensation for knowledge that was worth far more than any of the offers he'd received. Bucklin sat in the snow beside the open strongbox, pieces of a vast puzzle finally clicking into place. Morrison's persistent offers weren't about adding grazing land to his holdings. They were about securing a crucial piece of infrastructure for a railroad line that would be worth millions. The escalating harassment wasn't random intimidation, but a calculated campaign to acquire specific engineering knowledge along with the land itself. Most importantly, Uncle Jeremiah's engineering expertise meant that Bucklin now possessed information that could either make him wealthy beyond imagination or extremely dangerous to very powerful people. The documents proved not only that his land was essential to the railroad project, but that the current offers represented a fraction of its true value. But the documents also revealed why Uncle Jeremiah had ultimately lost his battle. As a trained engineer, he'd understood the technical requirements too well, had known that opposing the railroad meant fighting an enemy with virtually unlimited resources and political connections. The knowledge that should have been his greatest weapon had instead become a burden too heavy for one old man to carry. That evening, Bucklin spread Uncle Jeremiah's maps across his table and studied them by lamplight. The engineering notations were complex, filled with technical terms he didn't fully understand, but the basic message was clear enough. His 40 acres didn't just happen to be in the path of railroad development. They were the keystone that would make the entire project possible. The water source that fed his spring was the only reliable supply within 50 miles that could support a major maintenance facility. The elevation and soil conditions were perfect for the heavy machinery and extensive track work required for a mountain railroad. Most crucially, the specific geographic features of Prospect Ridge would allow the railroad to maintain acceptable grades while avoiding the expensive tunneling or bridge construction that would make the project financially impossible. Uncle Jeremiah's final calculations suggested that control of these 40 acres would be worth somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 to the railroad company, more money than most people in the territory would see in several lifetimes. But the calculations also revealed a weakness in the railroad's position that neither Morrison nor his backers had anticipated. The engineering requirements were so specific that no alternative location would work. If the Central Mountain Railroad couldn't secure Prospect Ridge, their entire route through the territory would become unfeasible. Years of planning, surveying, and land acquisition would be wasted, along with millions of dollars in investment capital. That knowledge transformed Bucklin's situation from desperate defense to potential negotiation from a position of strength. He wasn't just a stubborn old man clinging to worthless land. He was the owner of property essential to a project worth more money than most people could imagine. But it also meant that the stakes of the conflict had escalated far beyond intimidation and harassment. People who had invested millions in a railroad project wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary to secure land essential to that project's success. Uncle Jeremiah's mysterious death might not have been the result of a broken spirit after all. It might have been the result of someone deciding that an inconvenient engineer had become too dangerous to leave alive. Bucklin carefully rewrapped the documents and returned them to the strongbox, then carried the entire container into his cabin. Tomorrow, he would need to get word to Sarah Dalton and her resistance network, share the information that could transform their scattered legal battle into a coordinated campaign to expose the conspiracy and demand fair compensation for everyone who'd been deceived. But tonight, as wind howled through the pines and snow piled against his windows, Bucklin found himself looking at Rufus with new understanding. The old hound represented more than companionship now. He was the only witness to Uncle Jeremiah's true legacy, the only creature who'd been present when powerful men had made their final, fatal miscalculation. They'd assumed that killing the engineer would eliminate both the problem and the knowledge. They'd been wrong on both counts, and that mistake was about to cost them everything they'd worked to steal. The knowledge Uncle Jeremiah had left behind burned in Bucklin's mind like a coal that wouldn't cool. For 3 days after discovering the strongbox, he found himself walking the boundaries of his property with new eyes, seeing not just 40 acres of mountain timber, but the keystone of a conspiracy that reached from Widow's Hollow to Railroad. Boardrooms hundreds of miles away. The weather had broken enough to make travel possible, and Bucklin knew he needed to get word to Sarah Dalton immediately. But he also understood that the moment he revealed Uncle Jeremiah's documents, everything would change. No longer would this be a local dispute between a stubborn mountain man and ambitious neighbors. It would become a battle involving powerful interests who had already shown their willingness to commit murder to protect their investments. On the 4th morning, as he prepared for the dangerous ride to Sarah's ranch, Bucklin discovered he was too late to control the timing of the revelation. Jake Coulter arrived at dawn with 4 men Bucklin didn't recognize, hard-faced individuals who carried themselves with the professional confidence of hired guns. They positioned themselves around the cabin's clearing with military precision, cutting off escape routes while maintaining careful fields of fire. "Morning, Hayes," Coulter called out from his position near the tree line. "Mr. Morrison would like to have a word with you. Seems there might be some misunderstanding about the nature of your property ownership." Bucklin stepped onto his porch with his rifle in hand, Rufus beside him. The old hound sensed the tension and growled low in his throat, hackles raised at the sight of so many armed strangers. "My ownership seems pretty clear to me," Bucklin replied. "Got the deed and everything." Morrison himself emerged from the trees, mounted on his finest horse and dressed as if for a social occasion rather than a confrontation. But his eyes held a coldness that matched the December air, and his usual pretense of neighborly concern had been abandoned entirely. "Deeds can be challenged," Morrison said without preamble, "especially when there are questions about the deceased owner's mental competency during his final months. Jeremiah Hayes was a sick old man who may not have understood what he was signing. When he made his will, the legal threat was delivered with the confidence of someone who had judges and lawyers already in position to support any claims he chose to make." But Bucklin detected something else in Morrison's manner, an urgency that suggested recent developments had forced this confrontation before Morrison was fully prepared for it. "What's the real reason you're here, Morrison? Because this doesn't feel like a social call." Morrison dismounted and walked closer to the porch, though he stayed well within the protective range of his hired guns. "The real reason is that certain parties have grown tired of your stubbornness. They've authorized me to make one final offer. $15,000 Cash payment within 24 hours in exchange for a deed transfer and your immediate departure from the territory. $15,000. The amount was staggering, more money than most people would earn in a lifetime of hard work, but against Uncle Jeremiah's calculations of the land's true value to the railroad, it still represented a fraction of fair compensation. Generous, Bucklin said carefully. Mind if I ask what's driving such sudden generosity? Morrison's smile was thin and cold. Let's just say that railroad development schedules don't allow for extended negotiations. Construction crews will be surveying this area within the month, with or without your cooperation. The timeline confirmed Bucklin's suspicions about the pressure Morrison was facing from his backers. Something had accelerated the railroad's plans, forcing them to abandon subtlety in favor of direct action. But it also meant that time was running out for any solution that didn't involve violence. And if I decline this generous offer, then other arrangements will be made. The territorial government has broad powers to acquire private land for public projects, especially when the current owners aren't making productive use of their holdings. The threat was clear enough: eminent domain proceedings backed by corrupt officials who would rubber-stamp any seizure Morrison requested. But Bucklin sensed desperation beneath Morrison's confident words, an awareness that his carefully constructed conspiracy was becoming increasingly fragile. Seems like you're in quite a hurry, Morrison. Railroad breathing down your neck? Morrison's composure slipped slightly, confirming that Bucklin's guess had struck close to the truth. My timeline is my concern. Your concern should be accepting a reasonable offer while it's still available. What makes you think it won't be available tomorrow? Because tomorrow, Morrison said quietly, accidents might start happening again. And next time, they might not be limited to property damage. The threat against his life was delivered with the casual tone of a man discussing weather, but Bucklin caught the nervous glances exchanged between Morrison's hired guns. Professional killers they might be, but they understood the difference between intimidating an isolated mountain man and murdering someone who might have already shared crucial information with allies. Before I give you my answer, Bucklin said, there's something you might want to consider. He disappeared into the cabin, ignoring the tense shifting of the armed men around the clearing. When he emerged, he carried Uncle Jeremiah's leather portfolio containing the most important of the engineering documents, enough to prove his knowledge without revealing everything he'd discovered. Morrison's face went pale as Bucklin opened the portfolio and displayed the detailed railroad survey. Maps. The engineering calculations and technical specifications were clearly visible, along with Uncle Jeremiah's careful annotations about optimal routes and construction requirements. Seems my uncle was more than just a hermit with a small mining claim, Bucklin said conversationally. Corps of Engineers specialized in railroad construction. Funny how that never came up in all our neighborly conversations. The silence that followed was broken only by wind through the pine trees and the nervous shifting of horses. Morrison stared at the documents with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed plans collapse in real time. Where did you find those? Morrison's voice was barely above a whisper. Does it matter? Point is, I found them. Along with Uncle Jeremiah's calculations about what this land is really worth to the Central Mountain Railroad Company. One of the hired guns started to move closer, but Morrison held up a hand to stop him. The situation had moved beyond simple intimidation into territory that required careful consideration of consequences. What do you want, Hayes? Justice for my uncle to start with, fair compensation for everyone you've cheated and intimidated, and maybe some accountability for what happened to Mrs. Henderson's dog. Morrison's eyes narrowed. You can't prove anything about your uncle's death. Old men die all the time, especially when they live alone in harsh conditions. Maybe not, but I can prove everything about your railroad conspiracy, your use of violence and intimidation, and your systematic theft of land from honest people. Question is, how many important people are going to be embarrassed when this information reaches the territorial authorities? The calculation was visible on Morrison's face as he weighed the cost of exposure against the potential benefits of eliminating the problem permanently. But before he could reach a decision, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the forest. Sarah Dalton emerged from the trees with Tom Reeves and 6 other riders, all armed and positioned to control the high ground around the clearing. The resistance network had been watching, and their timing suggested coordination that went beyond coincidence. "Morning, Samuel," Sarah called out cheerfully. "Lovely day for a social visit. Hope you don't mind us joining the conversation." Morrison's face darkened as he realized that his carefully planned confrontation had become a standoff he couldn't win through force. Too many witnesses, too much documentation, and too many people who already suspected the truth about his operations. "This is private business, Sarah, no concern of yours." "Oh, but it is my concern. Seems Mr. Hayes has information that affects all of us who've been dealing with your generous offers lately. Information about railroad companies and land values, and the interesting ways certain people have been representing themselves in business negotiations." The weight of exposure settled on Morrison like a physical burden. His conspiracy had depended on secrecy and the isolation of his victims. With multiple witnesses present and documentation that could expose the entire operation, violence was no longer a viable option. But Bucklin could see in Morrison's eyes that retreat wasn't acceptable either. Too much money, too many powerful backers, too many commitments that couldn't be broken without devastating consequences. The man was trapped between forces he could no longer control, and trapped animals were often the most dangerous. "This isn't over," Morrison said finally, gathering his reins. "There are legal remedies for people who interfere with legitimate development projects." "Looking forward to discussing those remedies in court," Sarah replied, "especially the parts about legitimate business practices and proper compensation for acquired properties." Morrison and his men rode away without another word, but their departure felt more like tactical withdrawal than genuine retreat. The confrontation had clarified positions and revealed strengths, but it had also committed both sides to a conflict that could only end with total victory for one faction or the other. As the sound of hooves faded into the forest, Sarah dismounted and walked over to examine Uncle Jeremiah's documents. Her expression grew increasingly serious as she studied the engineering calculations and railroad survey maps. "Hayes," she said finally, "do you understand what you've got here?" "Beginning to. This changes everything, not just for you, but for everyone in the territory who's been dealing with Morrison's pressure tactics. We're not fighting a local land grab anymore. We're fighting a conspiracy that goes all the way to the territorial capital." Tom joined them on the porch, his weathered face grim. "Also means we're fighting people with resources we can't match and connections we can't break. They'll use every legal and illegal method available to get what they need." Bucklin looked around the clearing where he'd spent months rebuilding his life, then down at the documents that had transformed him from victim to primary target. The knowledge Uncle Jeremiah had left behind was powerful enough to bring down the entire conspiracy, but only if he survived long enough to use it. "So what's our next move?" Sarah folded the documents carefully and handed them back to him. "We take this information to people who have the authority to act on it. Territorial governor, federal marshals, maybe even railroad commission investigators, but we do it fast, before Morrison and his backers decide that eliminating witnesses is their only remaining option." The plan was reasonable, logical, and probably their only chance of success, but it also meant leaving the mountain that had become home, abandoning the cabin he'd worked so hard to restore, and trusting the justice system to protect people who powerful interests wanted eliminated. As if reading his thoughts, Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know this isn't what you wanted when you inherited this place, but sometimes circumstances choose our battles for us." Bucklin looked down at Rufus, who was watching the discussion with the patient attention of a dog who understood that important decisions were being made. The old hound had been his only companion through months of isolation and harassment, and the thought of dragging him into greater danger felt like a betrayal of their partnership. But the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant that Uncle Jeremiah's murder would go unpunished, that Morrison's victims would never receive justice, and that decent people would continue to be crushed by those with more money and fewer scruples. When do we leave? They left Prospect Ridge before dawn, moving through forest paths that Tom knew from years of hunting and tracking. The plan was to reach the territorial capital within 3 days, carrying Uncle Jeremiah's documents to Governor Harrison and Federal Marshal James Crawford, men whom Sarah's network had identified as honest officials not yet compromised by railroad. Money. Bucklin rode Sarah's spare horse with his most essential possessions secured in saddlebags. The engineering documents, his documentation notebook, and enough supplies for the dangerous winter journey. Rufus trotted alongside, the old hound maintaining his steady pace despite the challenging terrain and bitter cold. But they'd traveled less than 5 miles when Tom, scouting ahead, came racing back with grim news. Roadblock at Miller's Creek, he reported breathlessly. Morrison's men, maybe 8 or 10 of them, positioned to control the main trail down to the valley. Professional setup. They're not planning to let anyone pass. Sarah studied the map she'd brought, tracing alternative routes with her finger. What about the old mining trail over Carson's Ridge? Possible, but it'll add 2 days to our journey, and if they've got men watching all the routes. They do. The voice came from the trees beside the trail, and Morrison stepped into view, with his rifle trained on their group. Behind him, positioned to prevent escape, were the same hired guns who'd accompanied him to the cabin. The ambush had been perfectly executed. Morrison's men controlled the high ground, blocked the trail in both directions, and had positioned themselves with clear fields of fire that made resistance impossible without casualties no one could afford. "Seems you folks are taking an early vacation," Morrison said conversationally. "Unfortunate timing, considering the winter weather and dangerous trail conditions." Bucklin's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Morrison's men were already aiming, fingers on triggers. Any sudden movement would result in multiple deaths, and Morrison knew that Sarah's people wouldn't start a gunfight. They couldn't win. "What do you want, Samuel?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite their desperate situation. "Same thing I've always wanted. Reasonable people making reasonable decisions about business matters." Morrison's gaze settled on Bucklin. "Hayes, you've got something that doesn't belong to you. Papers that were taken from private property without authorization. Property I inherited legally. Property you've been trespassing on since you arrived. See, funny thing about land ownership. Sometimes the legal records don't tell the whole story." Morrison reached into his coat and withdrew a document that made Sarah gasp. It was a deed, properly notarized and official, transferring ownership of Uncle Jeremiah's 40 acres to the Morrison Ranch 2 years before Jeremiah's death. Uncle Jeremiah sold you his land, sold it fair and square, paid him $800 cash money, which he needed for medical treatment he was receiving in Denver. Poor old man was sicker than anyone realized, and the treatments were expensive. The deed looked authentic, bore the proper seals and signatures, and would probably hold up in any territorial court where Morrison had influence with the judges. But something in Morrison's manner suggested the document was either forged or obtained through coercion. "If you owned the land, why didn't you stop me from settling there months ago?" Morrison's smile was cold and satisfied. "Because we needed you to find what we couldn't locate on our own. Jeremiah hid those engineering documents somewhere on the property, and despite months of searching, we never found them. But we figured his nephew might have better luck, especially if he was motivated by harassment and financial pressure." The revelation hit Bucklin like a physical blow. His entire experience on Prospect Ridge, the harassment, the offers, even the apparent resistance movement, had been orchestrated to manipulate him into finding Uncle Jeremiah's hidden strongbox. He'd been a tool used by the very people he thought he was fighting, Sarah's resistance network, real enough, Morrison admitted, but monitored by people who report back to my associates. We've known about every meeting, every plan, every piece of evidence you thought you were gathering against us. Tom's hand moved toward his pistol, but one of Morrison's men shifted his aim to cover him. The hopelessness of their situation was becoming increasingly clear. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and surrounded by enemies who'd been playing a deeper game than any of them had understood. However, Morrison continued, I'm still prepared to honor my original arrangement. Hayes, you hand over those documents and everyone rides away unharmed. You keep the $15,000 payment I offered, and we all pretend this unpleasantness never happened. And if I refuse, Morrison's expression hardened, then we take the documents anyway, and you folks have a tragic accident on a dangerous mountain trail. Winter claims its share of travelers every year, especially those who venture out in bad weather without proper preparation. The threat was delivered with casual confidence, as if Morrison had already decided how to dispose of the bodies and cover up the murders. But Bucklin detected something in the man's manner that suggested the situation wasn't as completely under Morrison's control as he wanted to appear. You need those documents intact, Bucklin said slowly. The engineering calculations, the survey maps, the technical specifications. You can't build your railroad without Uncle Jeremiah's knowledge, and you can't get that knowledge if the documents are damaged. Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, confirming Bucklin's guess. The engineering expertise Uncle Jeremiah had accumulated was irreplaceable, crucial to making the railroad project feasible in mountain terrain. Simply seizing the documents wasn't enough. Morrison needed them preserved and interpreted by someone who understood their significance. So we reach an understanding, Morrison said. You provide technical consultation based on your uncle's work, and everyone benefits from the railroad development that's coming whether we cooperate or not. Technical consultation in exchange for my life and the lives of my friends. Technical consultation in exchange for everyone's financial security. The railroad's coming through, Hayes. Question is whether local people profit from that development or get crushed by it. Sarah spoke for the first time since Morrison's revelation. And the people you've already crushed. The families you've driven off their land, the businesses you've destroyed, the elderly woman whose dog you executed, Morrison shrugged. Business casualties. Progress always costs something. And usually it's the folks who can't adapt to changing circumstances. The callousness of the response revealed everything Bucklin needed to know about the kind of man he was dealing with. Morrison wasn't just greedy or ambitious, he was fundamentally indifferent to human suffering when it interfered with his plans. That indifference made him dangerous in ways that mere greed couldn't match. But it also represented a weakness that Bucklin might be able to exploit. The standoff stretched between them like a wire drawn too tight, each side calculating odds and consequences, while winter wind whistled through the pines above. Bucklin studied Morrison's positioning, the nervous gestures of his hired guns, and the way the man's confidence seemed to waver when challenged about the document's technical complexity. You know what I think, Morrison? Bucklin said finally. I think you're bluffing. You need me alive and cooperative, which means you can't just take what you want and disappear. Morrison's eyes narrowed. I wouldn't test that theory if I were you. Already am testing it. Bucklin slowly reached into his saddlebag, ignoring the rifles that swung to track his movement. See, Uncle Jeremiah was smarter than you gave him credit for. He didn't just hide documents, he booby-trapped them. From the bag, Bucklin withdrew a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. Morrison's men tensed, unsure whether they were looking at medicine or explosives, but Morrison himself had gone pale with understanding. Acid, Bucklin explained calmly. Concentrated enough to dissolve paper in seconds. Uncle Jeremiah attached it to the strongbox lid with a wire trigger. One wrong move while opening the container, and decades of irreplaceable engineering knowledge becomes worthless pulp. The lie was delivered with such conviction that even Sarah looked uncertain whether Bucklin was telling the truth. But Morrison's reaction suggested the possibility was believable enough to give him pause. "You're bluffing." "Am I? How much are you willing to bet? Because if I'm telling the truth and you shoot me, my horse is going to bolt, and those saddlebags are going to hit the ground hard enough to trigger Uncle Jeremiah's insurance policy." Morrison's calculation was visible on his face as he weighed the risk of losing everything against the certainty of gaining nothing. The documents were valuable only if they remained intact and interpretable, and any violence that might damage them would defeat the entire purpose of the confrontation. But before Morrison could decide how to respond, Rufus suddenly barked sharply and bounded toward a cluster of boulders 50 yards away. The old hound's nose had detected something that his human companions had missed: the scent of other men moving through the forest. "Expecting more company?" Sarah asked Morrison, but his expression showed genuine surprise. The answer came in the form of Federal Marshal James Crawford and 6 deputies emerging from concealment with rifles ready. The lawmen had positioned themselves to control the high ground Morrison thought he commanded, and their timing suggested they'd been tracking the confrontation for some time. "Samuel Morrison!" Crawford called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "You and your men will drop your weapons and surrender for questioning in connection with conspiracy, fraud, and murder charges." Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: shock, calculation, and finally desperate resolve. He'd built his conspiracy carefully over years, corrupted local officials, and intimidated witnesses, but federal intervention represented a level of authority he couldn't control or intimidate. "Marshal Crawford," Morrison said, attempting to project his usual confidence, "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. These people were trespassing on my property, and I was simply exercising my legal rights as a landowner." Crawford dismounted and approached with his badge clearly visible, though his hand remained near his sidearm. "No misunderstanding, Morrison. We've been investigating railroad fraud in this territory for months, and your activities have attracted considerable federal attention." "I don't know what you mean." "I mean using false identities to purchase land below market value, intimidating property owners with violence and harassment, and conspiring to defraud the federal government of millions in railroad development funds." Crawford's tone was professional, but cold. "We have testimony from multiple witnesses, documented evidence of your conspiracy, and sworn statements from people who've been harmed by your operations." Morrison's hired guns were looking increasingly nervous as they realized they'd walked into a federal operation that could see them hanged for murder if things went wrong. Professional killers they might be, but fighting federal marshals was a different proposition than intimidating isolated mountain men. "You have no jurisdiction here," Morrison said desperately. "This is territorial land, under territorial law. Railroad fraud is federal jurisdiction," Crawford replied, "as is conspiracy to defraud government land grants and using violence to interfere with interstate commerce. Your railroad backers made this a federal case when they started filing fraudulent claims for development funds." The revelation that federal investigators had been tracking the conspiracy independently transformed the confrontation from local standoff to the culmination of a larger investigation. Morrison's carefully constructed plans were collapsing not because of Bucklin's resistance, but because his backers had attracted federal attention through their greed and ambition. "Sarah," Crawford continued, "thank you for getting word to us about Mr. Hayes' situation. Your message reached us just in time to prevent what could have been a tragic outcome." Bucklin looked at Sarah with new understanding. Her resistance network hadn't been completely compromised. She'd been playing a deeper game, feeding information to federal investigators while appearing to cooperate with Morrison's surveillance efforts. "How long have you been working with the federal marshals?" "Since they contacted me 6 months ago," Sarah admitted. They'd been tracking railroad fraud throughout the territory and needed local people to help document Morrison's activities. When you inherited your uncle's property, we realized you might be the key to exposing the entire conspiracy. Morrison's face contorted with rage as he understood how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. You used me. All of you used my own surveillance against me while pretending to be victims. We documented your crimes, Crawford corrected. Your conspiracy, your violence, your systematic theft from honest people, every threat you made, every act of intimidation, every fraudulent land transaction has been recorded and witnessed, including Uncle Jeremiah's murder, Bucklin asked. Crawford nodded grimly. We have evidence suggesting your uncle was poisoned with arsenic over several months, slow enough to appear like natural illness, but concentrated enough to ensure his death. The territorial medical examiner is prepared to testify that his symptoms were consistent with deliberate poisoning. The confirmation of what Bucklin had suspected hit him like a physical blow. Uncle Jeremiah hadn't died of a broken spirit or natural causes. He'd been systematically murdered by people who wanted his land and his engineering knowledge. Morrison's composure finally cracked completely. You can't prove any of this. Jeremiah was a sick old man who died of natural causes, and everything I've done has been legal business activity. Actually, Crawford said, we can prove all of it, including the forged deed you used to claim ownership of his property and the conspiracy to use that fraudulent document to justify your harassment of Mr. Hayes. One of Morrison's hired guns made a sudden move toward his weapon, but Crawford's deputies were ready. The man went down with a bullet in his shoulder before he could clear leather, and the sound of the gunshot echoed across the forest like thunder. The remaining gunmen dropped their weapons without being asked, understanding that the situation had moved beyond anything they were prepared to handle. Federal marshals with legal authority were a different proposition than isolated mountain men with no backup. Morrison stood alone now, his conspiracy exposed, and his allies either dead, wounded, or surrendering. But instead of accepting defeat, he made one final desperate play. Hayes, he called out, you still need to understand something. The railroad's coming whether I'm involved or not. Powerful people have invested too much money to let one man's stubbornness stop progress. If you think federal marshals can protect you from that kind of pressure, you're more naive than your uncle was. Crawford stepped between Morrison and Bucklin. The only pressure anyone's going to face is legal pressure in a federal courtroom. The Central Mountain Railroad Company is under investigation for fraud, and their development permits have been suspended pending resolution of criminal charges. Morrison's final gambit had failed, but his words carried an ominous truth that would outlast his personal defeat. The forces behind the railroad conspiracy were larger and more powerful than any individual, and Bucklin's victory in this battle might only postpone a larger war. But for now, on a snowy mountain trail where justice had finally caught up with greed and violence, it was enough that truth had prevailed over deception and that Uncle Jeremiah's murder would not go unpunished. Spring came early to Prospect Ridge that year, as if the mountains themselves were celebrating the end of a long, dark winter. Bucklin stood on the porch of his restored cabin, watching Rufus chase a butterfly through the wildflowers that had sprouted where snow had lingered just weeks before. The old hound moved with more energy than he'd shown in months, as if the resolution of their troubles had lifted a weight from his shoulders as well. The cabin looked different now, not just repaired, but improved beyond Uncle Jeremiah's original construction. The roof was solid and weatherproof, the walls chinked tight against wind and weather, and the windows looked out over a valley that seemed more peaceful than it had in years. But the most significant change wasn't visible from the outside. Inside, mounted on the mantel above the fireplace, hung Uncle Jeremiah's Corps of Engineers commission and a photograph taken during the war. The old soldier looked young and confident in his dress uniform, unaware of the battles he would face decades later against enemies who wore suits instead of grey uniforms. The federal trials had concluded 3 weeks ago, with Morrison receiving 20 years in territorial prison for fraud, conspiracy, and murder. His hired guns had accepted lesser sentences in exchange for testimony that helped prosecutors unravel the entire railroad conspiracy. The Central Mountain Railroad Company had been dissolved, its assets seized to compensate victims of the land fraud scheme. But justice, Bucklin reflected, had come at a price that couldn't be measured in court verdicts or financial settlements. The knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Dalton stood on the porch with a familiar leather portfolio in her hands and an expression that mixed satisfaction with lingering concern. "Morning, Bucklin. Thought you'd want to see the final settlement documents." She spread the papers across his kitchen table, pointing to figures that still seemed impossible even after months of legal proceedings. The federal government had purchased his 40 acres for their true value as essential railroad infrastructure. $97,000, more money than he'd ever imagined possessing. "The territorial governor also wants to offer you a position," Sarah continued, "chief engineering consultant for legitimate railroad development projects. Seems Uncle Jeremiah's knowledge is valuable enough that they want to make sure it's used properly this time." Bucklin studied the offer, impressed despite himself by the salary and authority it would provide. He could live comfortably in the territorial capital, use his inherited expertise to guide development projects that would benefit ordinary people rather than enrich corrupt conspirators. "Tempting," he admitted, "but I've got a different idea." Over the past months, while legal proceedings had wound their way through territorial and federal courts, Bucklin had been developing plans that went beyond simply rebuilding his life. The money from the land sale would allow him to create something lasting, something that would honor Uncle Jeremiah's memory while helping others who faced similar challenges. "I want to establish a foundation," he said, "legal assistance for small landowners facing pressure from large development interests, investigation services for people who suspect fraud or intimidation, maybe even a newspaper that reports on territorial politics without fear of advertiser pressure." Sarah smiled. "That sounds like something Uncle Jeremiah would approve of, using railroad money to protect people from railroad conspiracies. Seemed fitting." They spent the next hour going through the settlement details, discussing how the foundation might operate and who could be trusted to help establish it. Tom Reeves had already agreed to serve as chief investigator, and several other members of the resistance network were interested in contributing their expertise. "What about Mrs. Henderson?" Bucklin asked. "Has she been compensated for what happened to her dog?" Sarah's expression grew sad. "She passed away 2 weeks ago, peaceful in her sleep. But the settlement includes funds for a small park in her memory, somewhere families can bring their pets safely." The news saddened Bucklin more than he'd expected. The elderly widow had become a symbol for him of innocent victims caught in other people's conflicts, and her death felt like an incomplete resolution to the injustices they'd fought to expose. "She knew about the settlement before she died," Sarah added gently, "knew that her dog's death had helped bring down the people responsible for so much cruelty. She said it gave her peace." As evening approached, Sarah gathered the legal documents and prepared to leave. The foundation would require months of work to establish properly, and she had other families to help while the legal framework was being developed. "One more thing," she said as she reached the door. "There's been talk about a memorial for Uncle Jeremiah, something here on the mountain to honor his service and his sacrifice." Bucklin considered the idea as he watched her ride away through the lengthening shadows. A memorial would be appropriate, but he'd already decided on the most fitting tribute to his uncle's memory. That evening, as twilight settled over the valley and the first stars appeared above the peaks, Bucklin began writing in a new journal. Not a record of harassment and intimidation, but a chronicle of resistance and ultimate justice. Future generations would read Uncle Jeremiah's story and understand that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and greed, even when the odds seemed impossible. Rufus settled beside his chair as he wrote, the old hound's presence a reminder of all the simple loyalties that had sustained them through the darkest months. Outside, the wind whispered through pine trees that had witnessed decades of struggle and would witness decades more. But tonight, at least, the mountain was at peace. Bucklin paused in his writing to look around the cabin that had become more than just shelter. It had become proof that determination and justice could triumph over wealth and intimidation. Uncle Jeremiah's legacy lived on not just in engineering documents and legal settlements, but in the knowledge that decent people would always find ways to resist those who confused power with righteousness. The foundation would help others fight similar battles, but the real victory was simpler and more personal. A man and his dog had found a place to call home, and no amount of money or influence had been able to take that away from them. Sometimes, Bucklin reflected as he returned to his writing, that was victory enough. The story of Bucklin Hayes and his faithful companion Rufus would become legend in the territory, told around campfires and in saloons whenever people needed reminding that courage and persistence could overcome the longest odds. But the man himself was content with quieter satisfactions, a warm cabin, a loyal dog, and the knowledge that he'd honored his uncle's memory by refusing to surrender to forces that confused might with right. In the end, that was all any man could hope for, to stand his ground when it mattered most, and to leave the world a little more just than he'd found it.